More than a few years ago, I was working as an entertainer in a gentleman's club and was idly sitting at the end of the bar one night when a couple came in. I had no contact with them and thought nothing of them being there until later. A few days after that night, the doorman handed me a piece of paper that had 2 names and phone numbers written on it, Laura and Richard. I was supposed to call one of them, so I called Laura, who told me they had been the couple who had been at the bar the other night, and they noticed me and thought I'd be perfect for a part in a movie Richard was producing. Would I be up for a meeting? Of course I would. Who wouldn't? I was told Richard would pick me up the next night at 7 and to wear something wild. 7 o'clock came the next evening, and I was ready in a white lace dress with ostrich feather trim when Richard showed up outside my building. So I went down, introduced myself, and got in the car. We agreed to go to a local bar, but first we had to go back to his place so he could pick up some contracts that he forgot. So off we went. He went into the house and came back out with a few envelopes and an open bottle of beer, a brand that I didn't drink. Plus, it's against the law to drink alcohol in a vehicle here. So I stuck the beer into the window well of his Jeep and we went to the bar. At the bar, he showed me what were supposedly scripts from his movie that he was producing and some contracts, and it looked pretty legit. Richard was very nice, and I was interested. I'd made some plans to go out later with my soon-to-be boyfriend, so I excused myself to call him on the bar's payphone and took my Corona that I ordered at the bar with me. As a dancer, I've always been taught by the other girls to never let your drink out of your sight. My boyfriend wanted to get going to another club, so I went back to the table where Richard was and told him I had to go. He didn't like that and tried a few different things to get me to go to the movie set, and he was saying I could meet Mickey Rourke and check out the set, but all I really wanted to do was meet my boyfriend, so I declined, took Richard's card, and left. I never heard from Richard again, but a couple of months later, the police came around to the bar I was working at. They had 2 big books of mugshots and a stack of Polaroids with them. They wanted to talk to all of us about a predator couple who had been setting up meetings with dancers by saying they were in the film industry, then drugging and raping them. They showed me the 2 mugshot books and asked if I saw anyone I recognized in the pictures, and I immediately identified Richard and Laura. They then showed me the Polaroids, which were trophy pictures of the couple in the act of attacking the poor drugged girls, and asked if I knew any of the victims and where I might find them in order to talk to the girls. I only knew a couple of the women in the photographs, but there were a lot of girls that this had happened to. Richard and Laura were prosecuted. He went to jail, but she didn't. She was from a wealthy family, and she also turned witness on him. About 12 years after Richard was convicted, I saw in the newspaper that he was up for the possibility of parole, so I wrote a letter to the parole board telling this story and urging them not to let him back out because he's a dangerous offender who should stay in prison for the entirety of his sentence. If I had drank that opened beer that he had handed me in his Jeep on the way to that meeting, I probably wouldn't have made it to the meeting and most likely would have ended up in the stack of Polaroids. Girls and guys, always keep your eyes on your drinks. Have fun, but be careful out there. This story is about an event that happened to my mother around 1972 when she was 8 years old. She told me about it since I was young, and she truly thinks about it and is affected to this day. To set the scene, both of my grandparents ran a restaurant/gas station in our hometown. They have always ran a business of some type since the 50s. This means that a lot of days, my mom would have to take the school bus home and stay by herself if my grandma had to stay and help run things. My uncle would usually come home on the bus with her, but he was a little older and sometimes had football practice. So was the case on the day of this event I'm getting to. So my mother arrived home on this day, let herself in the house, and put away her things. She had just recently received a new puppy and knew the first thing she needed to do was take her pup out to the yard to use the restroom. She wrapped the dog in a white towel and walked him outside. As she put down the dog, she shook its hair out of the blanket, flailing it in the wind. It was then when she noticed her neighbor's son was staring at her from across the street. This guy was in his late 20s and was known to be very strange and mentally ill. He would do psycho shit like killing the neighbor's pigs or skinning stray cats and hanging them from clotheslines in their yard. It was real sick shit. My mom said he always creeped her out and everyone else out. She said he would always stare at her when she would play outside and made her feel generally uncomfortable. She said he appeared out of nowhere in his yard that day, and as she shook out the blanket, he began grinning and waving. Feeling more than a little shook, she picked up her pup, went inside and locked the door. She began to do some homework, and after about 5 minutes of work, she heard a loud knock at the door. She slowly walked to the window to see who it was. She knew it wasn't my grandparents because of course they had keys. As she opened the blinds, her eyes locked with the creep from across the street, and he was already looking in the window. She then jumped and said she screamed a little as she shut the blinds. She ran to the door and made sure it was locked. She said he just continued with a slow, continuous thud on the door, almost in rhythm. She then said she got really terrified as he began speaking to her through the door. "Hi, sweetie. I saw you with your doggy. Let me in to see him." She was in shock. "Come on, let me in, sweetie. Please. I just want to see your puppy." In full freak mode, my mom screamed, "You need to leave now. You need to go back to your house. I don't know you." He kept knocking. I can see the fear in my mom's eyes when she describes that part, and it gives my whole body chills. That's when he said, "Damn it, let me in. I saw you waving your flag of surrender." I shit you not. The guy thought my mom was shaking hair from the blanket, and it was a flag of surrender and a sign for him to come over. My mom screamed, "I'm calling my daddy and the police if you don't leave now." With this, the knocking stopped. She tried to catch her breath and shake off her fear. She then got up from the door and ran to the basement level of the home. It was an old house, so the kitchen and rec room was down there, along with the only phone in the house. She made it to the phone and began to dial 911. All of a sudden, she heard a shatter from the next room. She looked over to see the crazed neighbor attempting to crawl through the kitchen window. He was ripping down the curtain as his upper body got through, and my mother screamed what was happening to the police on the phone. All of a sudden, he was bleeding from the abdomen where the window glass had cut him, as his lower half couldn't squeeze through. That's when my mom began hearing my grandmother's screams. "What the hell are you doing?" Then the guy yelling in pain and squirming out of the window as she hit him from behind with some tool that was laying in our garden on the side of the house where the entrance to the window was. He managed to get out of the window and bolted to his house. The police came. My grandma called my grandfather, and he arrived as well after shutting down the business as soon as she told him. They arrested him for breaking and entering, and something else I believe that was unrelated. Probation violation, I assume. On the day of his court date, he told them the white flag of surrender story, but this was the final nut on his crazy cake. as they put him in a mental institution that day. I later found out he died in the institution. Outside of the courthouse, the crazy redneck family of the creep tried to blame my 8-year-old mother, and the man's father called my mom a harlot. Needless to say, my army-trained grandpa beat the guy's ass on the courthouse steps as the local cops turned a blind eye. That story has always stuck with me. My mom had to receive therapy for it, so it haunts her to this day. We always can't help but wonder though, what would he have done to her if my grandmother didn't come home at that moment? This story begins sometime around my junior year of high school. I was 15 years old, and in that phase of my life where I didn't listen to anyone, yet at the same time was completely impressionable. At the beginning of the year, I was sitting in my 6th period chem class, probably zoned out, looking at my phone under the clunky gray lab table when I heard 2 people laughing to my right. The way the classroom was set up was a long rectangle, so essentially, the teacher wouldn't really be able to hear what was going on in the back. The people laughing were a guy and girl, Eric and Callie. They were somewhat popular, not the top of the food chain by any means, but everyone knew them. My younger sister knew Eric. They had a tennis match a month or 2 earlier. Eric was really funny. This is a crucial element to this story. He was definitely the class clown. He was tall, good-looking, and extremely charismatic. I wasn't attracted to him, but I could see why everyone else was. I think it was at this point in time where I made one of the most regrettable decisions of my life. I decided I wanted to be friends with Eric. Eric was in my 2nd, 5th, and 6th periods. The next morning, I poked him in the back of Spanish class. "Hey," I said, "I heard my sister kicked your ass in tennis." He turned around, with a goofy smile, his friends all looking at me. "Who's your sister?" His voice had a specific cadence to it. "Karen," I replied. I don't really remember the rest of this encounter, but I'm pretty sure he denied losing the tennis match. I think the conversation ended shortly thereafter, and my day continued until I saw him in math class. Algebra 2 was one of those classes where the teacher would lecture us for a while, give us some homework, and then let us have the rest of the period to work on it, so we wouldn't have to do it when we got home. I was looking at my paper, probably confused, when I heard a familiar voice. "Hey girl." I looked down and saw Eric, crouched next to my desk on the floor. "What's up?" He started asking me about tennis, and once I said that I played, a huge smile spread across his face. I think this is when he latched on to me. He asked for my phone number, and I gave it to him. That day, in our next period, he introduced me to Callie. She was older and really intimidating. I had never met anyone like her, and I was beginning to get excited at the prospect of these new, interesting friends. That night he kept texting me nonstop. He would ask me questions, and then would reply, "Ha ha 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 ha," to everything I said. I thought it was weird, but that was just his humor. After this day, he didn't leave my side. We spent most of the school day together, and then would be in constant contact after school. This was 2011, so we were mostly on Facebook or doing group phone calls with Callie and 2 other friends of mine I had brought into the group, Sasha and Natalie. There were lots of red flags. Eric wanted me to hold hands with him at school and told everyone he had taken my virginity. For some reason, this wasn't something I got too mad about. I just thought it was really weird. He would say things like, "Your virginity belongs to me." Again, I assumed it was a joke. I always assumed Eric wasn't attracted to girls, because he said he wasn't, although he would have sex with them and tell everyone, making fun of them. We would walk down the hallway after 5th period, and he would stop for a group of freshman girls waiting for him to give them each a peck on the lips. One time, we were walking to the bus, and there was a girl about 10 feet in front of us. She was cheating on her boyfriend, which I whispered to him, pointing her out. Yeah, it was childish, but keep in mind this was high school, and I was 15. He proceeds to run towards her, stops her, only to point at me and tell her what I said. She came over and yelled at me, and he watched, laughing. A few months into the friendship, I began sneaking out with Eric, bringing him alcohol from my dad's liquor cabinet. Eric was a heavy drinker, especially considering our age. This came to a head when he asked Callie and I to come over one night. His dad was in prison and his mom was in rehab, so he lived with his grandparents. We pulled up outside of his house and his car wasn't there. We waited for a while, and finally, he sped into the neighborhood and stumbled out of the driver's side, completely wasted. We followed him inside. His grandparents weren't home. I don't know what I said, but next thing I know, he grabs a knife off the kitchen counter and charges at me. I took off running and made it into Callie's car, slamming the door shut and locking it. He stares at me through the window before bursting out into laughter. My heart was racing and my blood ran cold. Callie got into the car and we left. I really don't know why I stuck around. It was like an abusive relationship. He told me he was the only guy who would ever find me attractive, but somehow it would turn into a joke and I would let it go. I believe the breaking point was when I heard about the baby squirrel. He had found a live baby squirrel after school and brought it home. His grandparents said they didn't want it in the house, so he walked outside and tossed it into the retention pond before walking back in. I wasn't there for that, but it disgusted me. In class a few days later, he knocked my pen off my desk and called me a bitch. "Eric, I don't want to be friends with you anymore," I told him firmly. "Just don't talk to me, okay?" His head snapped back, and he moved to the desk in front of mine. "Oh, you won't be able to ignore me," he laughed. "I'll know where to find you. I'm going to college next year, so," I reminded him. "Oh, is that so? You'll never be able to get away from me." "Are you threatening me?" "Yes." I know this sounds like a cheesy horror movie, but that was our exchange, word for word. The next week was endless phone calls, and him trying to get me to talk to him at school. At first it was comedic, when he thought I was going to change my mind, and then he came up to me in math class and opened his backpack. Inside were several large kitchen knives. "This is in case there's a zombie attack." Another big smile. I should have told the teacher at that point. I really should have, but it wasn't until a few days later when he pushed me too far. "Hey, guess what? I'm going to rape you, then murder you, and I'm going to make Natalie film it." I immediately went to the dean's office and told them everything. I had grown up being told not to snitch, but I couldn't focus in class anymore. I had been a good kid. I've never been in trouble, so they believed what I told them. Here's the kicker. They called him into the office, and he admitted everything. Dean Thomas sat me down the next day and told me that I needed to call the police. They said that there was clearly something wrong with him and that he didn't get it. They put a school version of a restraining order on him. He wasn't to talk to me, and during tests, he had to be taken to a separate classroom. He would do everything he could to get around those rules. He would talk about me right in front of my face, but wasn't technically talking to me. He said out loud to the class, "Some girl put a restraining order on me because she thinks I'm dangerous." The teacher laughed and said, "Doesn't she know you're joking? That's just you being Eric." The backlash I faced was enormous. All of his groupies shunned me and laughed at me. Even my own friends said that I was overreacting, except for Natalie. She said he made her feel uncomfortable and had started following her from class to class. When his birthday came, he approached me with Callie, and Callie said, He wants you to wish him a happy birthday." Eventually, a mutual friend called me and told me Eric had threatened to kill himself if I wouldn't talk to him again. I went back to the dean's office, and this time every dean, vice principal, and even the principal got involved. My school was big. There were 550 kids in my class. The school year ended, and without the protection of the authorities there, I was fielding more phone calls, and when I blocked his number, he would call me on Callie's phone. He would then drive around my neighborhood to see if my car was in the driveway. He even came to my tennis matches, the ones we initially bonded over. I could see a silhouette in the fence, just watching me. By senior year, things had calmed down. His attention was elsewhere, and I had picked my classes with the dean to ensure we weren't in any together. He was still watching though. I would be walking down the hallway with someone he didn't know, and all of a sudden, he would be walking with us, next to my unassuming friend. "Hi, I'm Eric. Nice to meet you." He told my friends he had decided to wait for me because we were soulmates, and I'd come around eventually. I graduated high school and moved out of town. I told my new college friends that if something ever happened to me, he was the one who did it. And that's all. There's no conclusion really, except he always knows when I come into town. I really don't know how, because I haven't blocked on everything. I suspect he still checks my house. He's been arrested since, on drug charges and a few DUIs. I'm looking at his mugshots as I write this to remember those dead eyes. Sometimes I do think, maybe I overreacted. Maybe it was all a joke. This story took place several years ago, when I was 23, although I was petite and looked much younger back then. I had just moved home to temporarily live with my parents while I got my life on track after breaking up with my boyfriend and quitting my job. I was working odd hours because I had picked up a part-time gig in the meantime, teaching evening classes at the local community college. On this day in question, I had been sitting around the empty house grading papers when I saw the mail truck come by. It was mid-afternoon, but I was still wearing my penguin cartoon pajamas like a bum. I watched the mailman drop off some letters for us through the windows in the front of the house that my parents refused to put blinds on because they love natural light. I resolved to give myself a break to get the mail after I finished grading 2 more papers. When I got up to go outside, I left the door unlocked behind me. I walked across the front lawn, and as I got to the mailbox, I looked up and I saw a man sitting in a black truck directly across the street from where I stood. I have never in my life felt such a sudden rush of terror for absolutely no reason. He didn't have a sinister glare. He didn't smile creepily. He was just looking at me, but it honestly scared the shit out of me. I quickly reached into the mailbox and started walking back towards the house, acting as normal as I could. When I was about a third of the way back, I heard a car door behind me close. I looked behind and saw that the man had gotten out of his truck and was now following me. I sped up my pace, pretty much speed walking, but not outright running. I got to the front door, went inside, and locked the deadbolt behind me. As I did so, I could see through the side lights that he had also picked up his pace and was almost at the porch. Since he would be able to see me from any of the living spaces, stupid lack of blinds, I grabbed my phone and ran to the bedroom that overlooked the porch. The doorbell rang, and I sat peering out of the crack in the blinds, with my heart racing a mile a minute and a cold sweat drenching down my body. When I didn't answer the door, he rang the doorbell again, and then again a minute later. I immediately called my mom at work and told her what was happening. During the course of our probably 5 to 10 minute long conversation, The doorbell was ringing increasingly often, and then banging on the door. My mom eventually told me to hang up and call the police. As I was on the phone with the dispatcher, the banging sound from the front door switched to two much louder bangs. It sounded like he was trying to kick the door open. A few seconds afterward, I watched him angrily speed walk to his truck, slam the door behind him, and squeal out of the neighborhood, leaving tire marks on the ground behind him. A couple minutes later, a perfectly nice cop arrived and took my information. I felt like a dumbass saying, "This guy knocked on my door and rang the doorbell for too long, then he left in a hurry." Nothing ever came of it, because I'm sure the cops have more meaningful things to track down, but I do know that this guy's behavior was erratic and simply not normal. I don't know what he would have said or done if I had answered the door, and I'm glad I didn't find out. I was 12 and my older sister and I were home alone for the weekend. I was waiting for a friend to pick me up and was getting restless. There was a knock on the door. Thinking it was her, I ran to answer it without checking through the peephole. A man was standing there with a clipboard and said he needed to check our gas meter. I was entrenched in the disappointment of my friend still not having arrived, so I just told him, "Yeah, sure, whatever you need to do." I didn't notice it at the time, but he wasn't dressed as a city official. He had on a green and purple shirt with bold stripes, like the host of Blue's Clues. He came in and immediately went upstairs to where our bedrooms were and walked into the open door of my room. Thank God my sister came down the stairs at almost the exact moment. She said, "Oh, is that Daphine's dad? Why is he going upstairs?" And I complained about how Daphne wasn't here and was going on about how unreliable she was when my sister cut me off. Wait, if Daphne isn't here, who is that? "He's here to read the gas meters," I said. Her face turned white. She flung open the front door and dragged me out, hand clamped over my protesting mouth. That's when she said our gas meters are outside. Neither of us had a cell phone. This was in the 60s, and obviously we weren't going back in the house to call authorities. That's when my ever-resourceful sister had a stroke of genius. A man was walking right by our house, and she motioned him over. She called loudly into the house, "Oh, Dad, it's good you're home. A man from the city is here to read the gas meters upstairs." And just like she'd hoped, the man on the street said, "What are you talking about?" The man in the striped shirt bolted out of the house. The man on the street asked us repeatedly if we were okay, if we needed him to stay and wait in the yard with us until our parents came home. He was very sweet. We were so startled that we barely thanked him before slamming and locking the doors and windows. As irate as my sister was that I let someone in the house, she begged me not to call the authorities because my parents left her in charge and she'd worried that she'd be in trouble. I didn't want to catch any heat from carelessly allowing some guy in, so I was on the same page. 3 weeks later, a girl in our community went missing. Same MO. She was home alone, and authorities found the door open and no signs of forced entry. My sister and I discussed our options, but deep down we knew we had no choice but to come clean. We told the police everything. I don't know if it ever helped, but they did tell us that they had reason to believe it was the same man. They also tracked down the man who helped us on the street. Turns out, we already knew him. He worked in the butcher shop. We just didn't recognize him. He was lifelong friends with the family after that. Our parents were mortified. They weren't angry with us, just glad we were okay, though they did review all the rules of caution and didn't leave us home alone for a while. They also found the girl and said that she had been held for a few days, then burned alive. They never caught the man, but fear not, he was in what appeared to be his early 30s in the 60s. so in any case, he has to be dead by now. I just thank God every day for my sister's quick action.